So good morning, good afternoon to all of you online. My name is Jürgen Menze. I'm a disability inclusion specialist at the International Labour Organization, the ILO, and I'm also the coordinator of the ILO Global Business and Disability Network. Thanks for joining us today for this webinar on the disability pay gap. What is it and how to go about it? Before we jump into the actual topic, let me just explain a few accessibility features and the way this webinar will run. You will have seen already next to me one of the two international sign interpreters that will accompany us today. You can also activate live captioning in English. And you are able to put in the chat your name, introduce yourself, share whatever you want in the chat. At the same time, we encourage you to put questions to the panelists, all of them, a subset of the panelists or one particular panelist in the Q&A box of Zoom. Then just to explain that after a short introduction of the topic, we will engage the panelists in 2 rounds of questions. So each panelist will answer one question in each of these 2 rounds. That will hopefully give us some time at the end of the webinar to also address your questions as audience. Now, just quickly about the ILO Global Business and Disability Network, the network organizing this webinar. We are a global coming together of currently more than 40 multinational enterprises. One of these enterprises also represented here today, Microsoft, and more than 40 national business and disability networks. Also one of these national networks with us today, the Business Disability Forum in the United Kingdom, and a few non-business allies, all working together to make more and better employment in the private sector a reality for persons with disabilities. So that's a little bit about the Global Business and Disability Network. So what is this about? We know that persons with disabilities are less likely to actually participate in the labor market. So compared to people without disabilities, they are overrepresented as within the group of unemployed people. So they're facing higher unemployment rates. When people with disabilities are employed, it's more likely that they are self-employed or also have part-time jobs. So this also leads to lower wages in general. But also these lower wages are not only explained by individual characteristics like educational attainment, experience, or occupational category. There's something else, which we will learn about. Obviously, it's disability-based discrimination in the labor market. Now, we're trying to break ground in the context of the Global Business and Disability Network by addressing this topic. We've addressed this topic as the ILO, more in terms of statistics from individual countries. But of course, we're working with businesses, so we also want to bring that discussion of the disability pay gap to a business community. So maybe let's quickly let the panelists open their cameras so I can just introduce them very quickly. So we have with us today my direct colleague, Sévane Ananian. He's a research specialist here at the ILO. Probably you're just like 50 meters away, just across the floor. Then we have Angela Matthews. She's the Director of Public Policy and Research at the Business Disability Forum, BDF, in the UK. And then joining us morning hours from the East Coast in the US, Rylin Rodgers, Disability Policy Director at Microsoft. So thanks to the 3 of you for joining us today and sharing your expertise. As I said, I will now start asking each of the panelists the first question. And we're going to start with Sévane. So Sévane, first in the ILO, you have worked as a wage specialist, and now the research department has a privilege to pick your brain now being a researcher in the ILO. And you're one of the authors of an ILO working paper on wage outcomes of people with disabilities that was launched actually last year. So can you tell us, please, a little bit more about the methodology of this working paper? And of course, what are the findings?
Thank you, Jürgen, and hello, everyone. So I will try to share my screen. Can you see the presentation maybe? Yeah.
Yeah, it looks good. Just put in presentation mode.
Okay, great. So indeed, maybe a bit of word of the context of the studies that was co-authored with my colleague Julia de la Ferrara. So it aimed at providing an overview of the labor market outcome of people with disabilities around the world in the context where there were few international studies available on this topic, and especially on the topic of earning. So the study aims at describing the relative situation of people with disabilities compared to people without disabilities. And we have tried to go a bit beyond just the comparison of the raw average, but we have tried to account in the analysis the specific socio-demographic composition of people with disabilities when we analyze wages. And the study is available in English, but it will soon be available in Spanish. So in terms of methodology, what have we done? We have worked on the survey data that are included in the ILO microdata repository, which include mainly labor force surveys and other household surveys for over 160 countries around the world. But for the analysis on wages, we have focused on 30 countries, including 14 developing countries. What definition have we used? It's people with disabilities are defined as those who are limited in the kind or amount of activities that they can do because of ongoing difficulties due to a long-term physical condition, mental condition, or health problem. And in practice, the identification of people with disabilities in survey relies on the Washington Group short set of questions which identify people with disability based on functioning. We have looked at the hourly wage of employees so as to take into account the possible differences in working time between people with and without disabilities. And we have looked at three main indicators, which are the position of people with disability in the overall hourly wage distribution in their countries, their average pay gap between people with and without disability, which we have called the disability pay gap, and the share of the pay gap that is not explained by socio-demographic characteristics such as education and age, as well as the broad occupational category. And to do this decomposition of the pay gap, we have relied on a Blinder-Waraka econometric technique, which is standard when in the analysis of pay discrimination. So in terms of findings, so the first finding is that the people with disabilities tend to be located at the bottom of the wage distribution of their countries. And this is visible with the chart that you have on the screen, which looks at the incidence of low pay among people with and without disability. And as you can see, across the countries that we have in our sample, we see that 32% of people with disability are low paid on average, whereas it is the case only for 22% of people without disabilities. And this overrepresentation of low pay among people with disability is visible at each of the country income groups that we have studied, which is high income group, the upper middle income group, and the low and lower middle income group. And for this, this chart, the definition of low pay that we have used is the usual ILO definition, which is being paid less than 2/3 of the median of the wage in the country. So this difference in pay between people with and without disabilities can be due in part to the socio-demographic characteristic of the population with disability. So to analyze this, we have computed the average pay gap between people with and without disability. And we have tried to estimate the share of the pay gap that cannot be explained by human capital characteristics such as age and education, and the occupational category, as these factors can have an impact on the pay that people with disability receive. And as you can see with the chart on the screen, on average, employees with disabilities are 12% less than other employees, and 3/4 of this gap is not explained by factors such as education, age, and the broad occupational category of people. And this substantial unexplained pay gap is highlighted in a light blue on the chart that you have on the screen. So there are several reasons that can explain this, this substantial unexplained pay gap, which includes, for instance, limitation to the productivity of people with disabilities, for instance, due to a mismatch between their capacities and the requirement of their job. There can be also trade-off between job flexibility or workplace accommodation and the level of their wages when they are negotiated with employers. And there can also be mere discrimination against this population group. So maybe this is all for me now to set the overall framework of the study.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Sévane. It's obvious it's a very dense data. And thanks for trying to make it digestible. I think I also just dropped in the chat the link to the study, so people who are listening right now can also read up on that study with some more in a calmer moment, so to say. But no, thanks, Sévane, for setting the scene, basically how we as ILO approach this and what the data is you have found with your colleagues. Now, let's first move to Angela. Angela, so you work at the Business Disability Forum in the UK, so one of the national business and disability networks of the Global Business and Disability Network. And in the UK, the government is expected to make it actually mandatory for companies to measure and report on the disability pay gap. And you have led BDF's work in this area for many years already. So can you tell us a little bit more about the situation in the UK and what BDF has been doing?
Yes, sure. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. So in the UK, we've been talking about mandatory reporting for a few years now in different contexts. Let me give you a little bit of history. So in the UK, we have what's called a disability employment gap. So that refers to the difference between non-disabled working age people who are in work and disabled working age people who are in work. And there, at the moment, you know, over the last few years, the percentage of working age disabled people in work fluctuates between kind of 50 to 54%. And the UK government now have a target to make that 80%. So over the last few years, last sort of 3 to 4 years, the government has been considering making it mandatory for large businesses, and large business here in the UK is more than 250 employees. So making it mandatory for large businesses to report the number of disabled employees it employs. The thinking behind this is that, well, if we get large businesses to report, we can't make small businesses do it because they don't have the resource. It's much harder. They have less time and the like to do it. So we'll make large employers collect data and report it. This will give us a better, more informed picture of the number of disabled employees who are being employed. So the driver behind this is that we want more disabled people to go into work. At the same time, we're not too sure if our data on this issue is quite enough. So we've got those two things sort of in tandem going on at policy level in the UK. So the previous government in 2021, so this was the Conservative government, put out a public consultation to say, should we make it mandatory for large employers to report the number of disabled people they employ? Now, that kind of policy is a bit difficult for a number of reasons. Firstly, if we're only looking at large employers, as Sévane said, a lot of disabled people in the UK are employed either on 0 hours contracts, they are self-employed, or they work for small and medium-sized businesses. All of those situations are not included in disability workforce reporting proposals. So immediately, for that reason alone, we don't have a big picture, we don't have a full picture if that proposal came in and became mandatory. So it kind of doesn't help fill that data gap. Then in the summer last year, we had a change in government and the Labour government came in. Now, the Labour government had a manifesto commitment to bring disability pay gap reporting in, but it was quite silent on mandatory disability workforce reporting. So this government have assumed that large employers already know how many disabled people they are employing, and they have proposed and introduced legislation to Parliament to say large employers, so that's employers with over 250 employees, you will have to report the disability pay gap of your workforce. That has been laid in Parliament, so it is going through the parliamentary debate phase at the moment, and very imminently we are expecting the government to publish a public consultation on how disability pay gap reporting could work, and we are expecting that really imminently. So at BDF, or Business Disability Forum, we have got our members and some disabled employees working in our member organisations together. And we have, since 2021, these groups have been following the policy development of mandatory disability workforce reporting and disability pay gap reporting. We've collected, what are disabled employees' views on that? Do they really like it? Are there any impacts or negative consequences that they see from this focus on numbers and reporting a single percentage? And what is employers' views? Actually, is this straightforward? Do they have the capacity to do it? And how resource intensive is it to implement disability pay gap reporting? So that's what we've been doing in the UK.
Thanks a lot, Angela. It's really interesting to hear also how different governments focus, so to say, their attention to disability at work. So we'll come back to you after this round of questions. But now we want to first hear from Rylin. So you work for Microsoft. Some of you might have heard here in the audience about this small enterprise. It's one of the enterprises, also a member in the Global Business and Disability Network from the US. And like some other countries, the US allows for paying workers with disabilities a sub-minimum wage. So let's repeat this. Like some other countries, the US allows for paying workers with disabilities a sub-minimum wage. I think this is an important message. So can you please share a bit about the US context, also maybe how the current administration impacts the work, and how this obsolete legislation in the US negatively actually affects companies like Microsoft?
Yeah, I'm pleased to be here, and I think it was valuable that you said it twice, and both times that you said it, it like physically hurts me to hear it, but that reality exists. In the US in 1938, so a little while ago, there was a change in employment code to allow employers to get a wage certificate called 14C that allowed for paying individuals with disabilities less than the minimum wage. Obviously, the context and the social realities and employment opportunities for people with disabilities were very different in 1938 than they are today. And the fact that this still persists is, in my personal opinion, horrific, and in Microsoft's opinion, a business problem that needs significant change. So to just tell you a little bit about where we are in the United States, some states have taken legislative action that prohibits that practice. About 17 states no longer allow disabled employees to be paid less than minimum wage, but it still persists. And in 2023, about 44,000 individuals across the United States were paid less than the minimum wage. And by less than minimum wage, we're talking as little as cents of a US dollar, so 33 cents an hour, not anything close to an equitable or appropriate remuneration for any type of labor. At Microsoft, we have never paid some minimum wage, but we believe our role in addressing it is more than our own business practice. And so we've really looked at the landscape of talent and our business need to have diverse talent in terms of skills and perspective to drive the innovation that allows us to make products and services that meet our goals of empowering every person and organization on the planet. And that means disabled talent. So that type of broad perspective on talent has really driven us to understand employment landscapes in the US and countries around the world. That's why some of this coalition work is so critical, because we're an employer in multiple countries. Several years ago, we became increasingly concerned about the block to talent that sub-minimum wage is in the US and globally. So we changed our supply chain. In addition to saying that we, as Microsoft, would not pay sub-minimum wages and that we require that our employees are paid equitably, we require anybody who does business with Microsoft to pledge that same piece. So you cannot be a Microsoft employer if you pay sub-minimum wage. And that was an important change because it talks about the ability of a business to move things forward separate from political change. The other place is that we have engaged in the political conversation around this. We have actively lobbied for and spoken out and shared our perspective with legislators in the state level and in Congress to end sub-minimum wage. Last year, we gave public comments to a regulatory process that was started to end this practice. We will continue to do so until this is fully resolved, because the reality is that it creates blockers to talent. It creates an opportunity where not all individuals with disabilities are looking at what the possibilities for employment are. And for us, it also creates an economic burden, a legal burden, because our supply chain prohibits sub-minimum wage. If we are doing business in states that still allow it, we have to do an extra legal review of all of our contracts. So the fact that there's inequity in the American system is a disadvantage to American employers. So it's a real chance to bring the business case to appropriate policy and really to say, both in the United States and globally, how we need to modernize public policy and business practice so that we bring all talent into our businesses and into our economy, because it's critical in every sector and every community that the people that are currently unemployed or underemployed, that their talents are contributing to our society. And it's absolutely critical that that's happening in an equitable way. So sub-minimum wage is horrifically outdated and a policy whose time is definitely past, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. And that's why I appreciate this conversation, because it's absolutely about ensuring a wide variety of employment opportunities, about making sure that people's roles match their talents and skills so that they're not underemployed. And I also really loved the earlier point about the reality that some of us as disabled people might negotiate flexibilities in our workplace, and that creates an economic trade-off in our wages. And how do we get to a place where there's a better match so that we are appropriately and equitably remunerated? So lots of work left to do in the United States and in the other countries that still allow this practice. But then lots of work to do even where sub-minimum wage no longer exists. And we're excited to continue the conversation and bring our voices to that work.
Well, thanks a lot, Rylin, for these very powerful messages. I remember you said, look, sub-minimum wage is actually a roadblock, so to say, to access talent, including talent with disabilities. And that's a very powerful message. And I love what you said about Microsoft does not work with suppliers who accept sub-minimum wage. I think leveraging the power of business in the wider ecosystem is very much appreciated and well noted. Now, let's stay with you, Rylin, going inverted, the inverted order. So going Rylin, Angela, and Sévane for the second round of questions to the panelists. So based on what you just explained to us, so what can different parts of society, including business, but beyond business, do to make equitable remuneration a reality for persons with disabilities in the US, and as you said at the end, also beyond the US?
I love how broad this question is because I think there's several pieces that I'll point to. One is the area of skilling and education. We're in an environment where there is still access gaps in terms of individuals, disabled individuals building their skills for the job that they prefer, for the job that matches their talents and passion. So really thinking holistically about what do we mean about skilling. We absolutely mean and should discuss things like public education. In the United States, we think about it as kindergarten through 12th grade, and higher education opportunities, and making sure that all of those settings are fully inclusive. But there's also a growing reality in the digital world and the shift in terms of skilling and employment opportunities that people can gain certificates and build their skills without participating in a higher education, maybe traditional degree program. And so thinking right now, as people are shifting the skilling development process across sectors, about making sure that all of that is designed fully inclusive, not that we come back afterwards and think about it, making sure that it works well for a screen reader or that it works for a person with a physical disability. But when we're designing and deploying skilling to build talent, that it is fully inclusive from the beginning. So I think that's a real critical piece to get the talent of people with disabilities ready to go in our economy in an equitable place. I do think there's a critical role for business. Businesses like Microsoft that really benefit from the innovations that come from disabled talent have seen how critical it is, not just to get our hiring rates up to a place that brings that talent into our workplaces, but also to make sure that our workplaces are set up to support that talent and the career growth. And some of that is about measurement. How are we tracking how disabled talent is supported in our environment? How are we equipping the culture of our companies? One of the things we've done at Microsoft for multiple years now is that in lots of workplaces, there's required training. Many of us might groan or roll our eyes at that required training is sometimes painful and not our favorite part of work. But at Microsoft, I'm really proud that one part of our required training for every employee is about accessibility. And it really raises the bar. It gives all of us the information and the tools we need to support each other in the workplace, whether our coworker has an apparent or non-apparent disability, whether our customer might be sharing an accessibility need or might have an accessibility need but not sharing it. If we up-level our culture to be fully inclusive, then we're creating an environment that allows for our disabled talent to really move forward. And then the final piece that's been a bit of a learning for me since I left the not-for-profit or NGO environment and came to corporate America is the critical importance of leaders in business settings being out, vocal, and proud of their disability status. I continue to be impressed about how that makes a change. How being very clear that leaders at all levels of the structure have lived experience with disability really gives people an opportunity to think about their trajectory, their career growth, and what they want in terms of wage equity, and asking for things like promotions and raises and reasonable accommodations. So I think that's been a critical piece for those of us that live with disabilities, whether they are visible or invisible, to be very clear about how our disabilities are part of the talent that we bring to economies and really say publicly and give room for that discussion about the critical value of that talent to our employers and to our economy, to really give space for that equity discussion and allow other people to join in that.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Rylin. Very comprehensive answer. We will have to create some snippets. We use snippets because you touched upon very many points and all very important. So thanks so much for that. Let's move back to Angela in the UK. Angela, in your first intervention, you said that you were working with employees with disabilities and employers to actually find out what they think about reporting on the disability pay gap, which one might, without reflecting too much on it, might think, well, it's a good thing, right? No, we get some more data and we understand better whether persons with disabilities get the same wage or not. But in your BDF research, you have identified many unintended, and not only unintended, but also negative consequences of doing so, of measuring and reporting the disability pay gap in companies. So can you please share with us what these consequences can be and any ideas how to address them?
Yes, thank you. So this was a qualitative piece of work. We've got some really great pieces of quant work in the UK. There's a coalition here in the UK called Disability at Work, and some of their studies have been so pivotal to the debate between what employers do in practice, what they put out there in terms of some of the schemes they sign up to, the kind of almost marketing of disability inclusion, but then actually what's behind that. Does disability inclusion actually felt for disabled employees? Look at some work from Kim Hock and Professor Melanie Jones on disability inclusion in practice, some of the government schemes that employers do, but does it necessarily mean more inclusion at work? And also Melanie Jones's work alongside Sévane's on the quantitative study of disability pay gap. I can't match that, but what we did want to do is, alongside the government's proposals, their workings out, particularly this movement that I described earlier, from mandatory disability workforce reporting all the way through to the now focus on disability pay gap reporting. I wanted to get employees' views, so I just wanted 10 employees in a room. I put out, please help me with this. Anyone with disabilities who wants to come and inform this policy. I got 64 responses. I did the same to employers. I got 64 employers as well. So my sort of intended methodology of a focus group sort of had to go out of the window a little bit. But what we found really surprised me. And actually, a lot of disabled employees were really worried about the introduction of mandatory workforce, but also pay gap reporting. And the reason that came up the most is, how on earth do you define disability? And what was really, really interesting is that a lot of disabled people in workforces said, actually, we've tried to get our employer to not use the legal definition as per our UK Equality Act 2010. Like, we have tried for years to get our employers to move away from that. So we don't want that definition to be used. And there was kind of a sort of anxiety that a lot of disabled employees and the disability networks in organisations had worked really closely with their employer and D&I teams for a few years to get a good, beyond compliance, beyond legal narrative about disability. And they were worried that kind of a mandation from the government would sort of come in and say, sorry, scrap that. You need to be reporting against this definition now. So the standardising of language was a key concern to disabled employees. Also, what employees said is that they feel pressure now to say they have a disability. And actually, they felt that being a disabled employee in an organisation wasn't really enough anymore. You have to declare or disclose or say that you're disabled. Just being there isn't enough anymore. And this was really interesting when we went to employers and asked them about disability pay gap reporting, because a lot of employers, most of them actually, How they currently do disability workforce reporting, so measure the number of disabled employees in their organisations, is anonymous. And with the introduction of these proposals about disability pay gap reporting, they said the only way we'll be able to do that is if we start data collection again, because we'll effectively have to go back to our workforce and say, hey, thanks for sharing your data and telling us you're disabled. Can you please redeclare it now, but this time next to your name on your HR record, because we need to know what you earn as well so that we can do pay gap reporting. Employers were really concerned. In one employer's words, I'm just not going to do that. In another's, I can't believe the government wants us to do this. And disabled employees just felt at a time where a lot of organisations in the UK are shrinking, particularly in the public sector, this just felt like the wrong time to be mandating a policy which was going to, in effect, ask disabled employees to put their salary, their working hours next to their disability status. And then we looked at the role of adjustments. Was there anything in terms of how disabled employees are treated in terms of getting support, where these policies of mandatory reporting and pay gap reporting could have an influence there? What we actually found was disabled employees saying they were deliberately targeted and almost in one disabled employee's words, bullied into promotion so that employers could see their disability pay gap shifting, to the point that one employee said, I left my organisation. I didn't want to be promoted. I need to manage my disability. I need to have a home life. I need to manage my job. I need to manage my treatment. I just need to stay where I am and just keep there and earn what I earn. Similarly to what Rylin said, and also Sévane, also in his presentation, we saw overwhelmingly that over 50% of disabled employees wanted to reduce their hours, and over 30% of disabled employees actually wanted to reduce the seniority of their role. And they said it's their choice to earn less. They also said that some of those requests had been declined. In-depth interviews, employers also told us they are declining those adjustments because it will affect their disability pay gap. In addition, we also heard from employers that those who were, already invested in large-scale disability support or employment support programs, or those who were halfway through negotiating or moving on to those programs, they felt that there was a bit of a mixed message from the government. Do you want us to take part in these programs to employ more disabled people or not? Because each employer who takes part in these at the moment told us that they actually see a widening pay gap. So there's a mixed message there. In the UK also, the government is very keen on more employers offering more flexible working and job carving opportunities. But again, employers said, actually, ordinarily we'd be happy to do that. But government, you are implementing a policy that makes transparent the disability pay gap, which is directly affected when we do these adjustments. Overwhelmingly, though, we are not against reporting. Hey, I'm a researcher. I love data. But what we're trying to do at BDF is try and sort of identify these unintended consequences for the sake of making sure that mandatory reporting is as effective as possible. We really want to make sure, and this, I was thinking of this as Rylin was speaking, it's about if you focus on the number, the reported number only, you get some kind of not great practices, because it doesn't matter about the experience almost if all businesses are asked to report is the number. Diversity and that number, it is not the goal. The goal is that everyone and disabled people have the careers they want and they are included and valued and respected at work. A lot of disabled people said, we want to stay where we are. And it's not in our sights to be promoted or to change where we are. And yet they said, with these increased sort of reporting mandatory reporting and disability pay gap reporting, I'm starting to feel targeted as a disabled employee. So these are the types of things that we really need to make sure do not prevail in workplaces, because they're not inclusive practices. So what we want to do is make sure that any mandatory reporting does not cause poor disability inclusion practices in organisations for disabled people. A lot of disabled people said, actually, what the goal is that I get adjustments. And in a focus group that I held with disabled employees, one sticks out in my mind where there was a lot of anger. The anger, in one employee's words, was, why are you asking me about reporting numbers when I haven't got the ramp that I asked my employer for 6 months ago? In a context where the government is overwhelmed and doesn't have a lot of budget, and a lot of UK employers are reducing their workforces, we can't do everything. So employees, disabled employees said, look, what is the priority to the government? Is it that we get our adjustments and we can stay in work? Or is it that we report these numbers? Because employers themselves said that they can't do both either. And what it meant from an employer perspective is that in 3 different employers said to me, actually, reporting is becoming so much now that we are actually having to change who we recruit. We're not recruiting HR folk who are good with people anymore. We are employing HR data analysts. And a lot of public sector employers also said, we don't have the resource to change things for the better and be analysing data. Some employers even said they have stopped projects to improve their workplace adjustments processes so that they can cope with increased reporting in organisations. So, as I said, there are some unintended consequences that could be really poor if we don't watch them and purposefully make sure they don't happen. And that's our goal here at BDF. We want employees to get everything they need to stay in work. And we just want work to feel good for disabled folk.
Well, thanks a lot, Angela. It's really fascinating since you put a lot of time, effort over years already in picking the brains, especially of employees with disabilities, about the unintended and negative consequences of measuring and reporting the disability pay gap. And it shows like how important, again, it is nothing about us without us hearing directly from those who are affected, because you might have well-intended governments, well-intended employers, which are doing things that are actually against what people with disabilities at work want. And you said, it was a very powerful example. You said, look, you asked me to now report and disclose, putting exactly my payroll next to my disability status, and I don't even get a ramp. So what, this is really, I mean, this was a powerful example. And thanks for sharing that. It's really about choice, flexibility, adjustments. And at the same time, of course, people with disabilities should earn what non-disabled people earn, but not in this way, the way you described it. So it's very powerful, and definitely also going to rewatch the recording of what you just presented. So thanks so much. Coming back to Sévane, who has been very patient now, being the last one in the second round of questions. So coming back to the working paper that you co-authored, and let me just ask you to switch on the camera. Sorry, I had blocked you there for a moment. So what are the key recommendations? We already heard a lot now, and now you have to tell us how to fix it all. What are the key recommendations for the actors in the labor market around the world? I mean, it's a global working paper. So how can we improve the wage outcomes for workers with disabilities? What are the key recommendations from the working paper?
So yeah, it's a complex task that probably involves multiple policies, but I will try to...
Sorry to interrupt, we see your email. Probably that's not what you wanted to share publicly, no. So maybe you switch.
Yeah, can you see?
Not yet, but I'm sure it's gonna come in a moment. something.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, all good.
Okay. So yeah, it's a complicated questions, and that probably involve multiple policies, but I will try to focus on policies that are more specifically targeting the wage of workers. And for sure, there are minimum wage. We have already discussed a bit this point with Rylin, and since we have seen that people with disabilities tend to be located at the lower end of the wage distribution, this makes it a relevant policy to improve their wages. And in terms of existing international standards to this purpose, there is, of course, a minimum wage fixing convention, number 131, which calls for systems of minimum wage with a broad coverage of workers, and it can be read for people with disability together with the vocational rehabilitation and employment convention, number 159, which set out the principle of equal opportunity and treatment for people with disabilities. And in this regard, in some countries, the setting of lower minimum wage rates for people with disabilities is considered to be a form of discrimination. And in line with this, several countries such as Argentina, Czechia, Slovakia, the UK also, or in France, have abolished in the past years minimum wage rates specific to the population of people with disabilities. Another important possible measure is collective bargaining. So collective bargaining enables the party to tailor the provisions of the collective bargaining agreements to specific contexts, such as specific sectors of activities, and to adapt them when the circumstances change. And there was a couple of years ago an ILO survey that reviewed collective bargaining agreement around the world, and around 2/3 of the provisions of the collective bargaining agreements reviewed aimed at fostering around 2/3 of the collective bargaining agreements included provisions that aimed at fostering inclusions, and including through clauses prohibiting discrimination against various groups, including people with disabilities. And there were also some agreements that tackled specific issues such as work time arrangements for people with disabilities, or their reasonable workplace accommodation, the work environment, their hiring, or the work duties for this specific group of workers. So in terms of other possible policies that are mentioned in the paper, there are also the wage subsidies. So the wage subsidies aim at affecting the labor costs in favor of people with disabilities. In this regard, there are many countries that have adopted such policies, such as in Sweden, and with subsidies that can be granted for a certain period of time after, for instance, the recruitment of the person with disabilities. There are also, in terms of measure, pay transparency measures. We have already discussed it a bit with Rylin, but it encompasses various tools such as regular pay disclosure within companies that aimed at exposing bias or discrimination in compensation practices, so as to prompt further actions with a view to rectify these imbalances. But of course, they must be well designed, and Angela has highlighted this. And I think our study also highlights the fact that monitoring the relative situation of people with disabilities on the labor market is an important is key for the design of policies, and this requires the regular data collection on earnings and hours work, but also the inclusion from time to time of a module allowing the identification of people with disabilities in household survey, such as labor force surveys that include data collection on earnings and hours worked. And as I said, the socio-economic inclusion of people with disabilities is a complex task and requires various policies. So I just wanted to highlight some other relevant international standards for this purpose. There is, of course, the International Labour Standard on Non-Discrimination and Equality of Opportunity and Treatment, and specifically the convention, the ILO Convention on Discrimination in Employment and Occupation, number 111. So it lists grounds of possible discriminations. Disability are not included among these grounds, but it allows member states, after consultation with the social partners and other appropriate bodies, to include extra grounds such as disability in the purpose of the convention. And also there is the International Labour Standards on Vocational Guidance and Rehabilitation for People with Disability, namely Convention 159, which calls state parties to formulate, implement, and periodically review national policy aiming at the rehabilitation, vocational rehabilitation, and the employment of people with disabilities. So these are complementary framework to do on directly on wages.
Great, thanks so much, Sévane. Also hiding some of the ILO labor standards in the area of disability specifically. So thanks so much. Now, we have about, well, a bit more than 5 minutes for some questions that we received from the online audience, and thanks to the listeners for sending questions. I want to first take, I will have to paraphrase a few of the questions to merge them, so to say, but I see two big topics from the questions, either that were put in the chat or in the Q&A box. The first one is more about, I would say, the global south, low-income countries. How is our discussion here, having representatives from the US and UK? I mean, it's obviously relevant for the global south, and we have here in the chat colleagues from African countries put something in the chat. We got a question from a colleague based in Bangladesh. So how, the first, maybe just to confirm, Microsoft applies this. We don't work with suppliers who pay less than the minimum wage. Rylin just put that in the chat, and she's just nodding here. So that's important. It's a global approach. And maybe when we talk about the global south, low-income countries, maybe just based on what we got here, anybody who wants to take the floor, of course, feel free to do so, Rylin, Angela, but maybe also back to Sévane. I think you said your working paper had data from 30 countries. Would you be able to tell us a little bit about the differences between, let's say, OECD countries and non-OECD countries, or that's something that the working paper hasn't quite disaggregated?
So you want me to start?
If I mean, yes. So that was a particular a specific question to you, and then Angela, Rylin, if you want to add on the issue of low-income countries, the global south, and the disability pay gap, you're more than welcome. But maybe Sévane, not sure if it was okay to put you on the spot. I'm just wondering if the working paper actually addresses this issue.
No, it's true. As the working paper, we have tried to disaggregate it when it comes to the disability pay gap, the information by country income group. So not the split is not OECD or non-OECD countries, but we have separated high income countries, upper middle income countries, and low and lower middle income countries, especially when we compute the average pay gap for those selected countries that we have in the sample, and also when we compute the share of this pay gap that is not explained by the factors that are taken into account, such as education, age, and occupational category. And we see that the trend is that there is a bigger disability pay gap in the low and lower middle income countries that we have in our sample in comparison to the high income country. In high income countries, the average pay gap is around 9%, and in low and lower middle income countries, for the few countries that we have in the sample, there are some challenge with the data when it comes to I mean, in terms of number of countries on which we can compute the estimates, but we have an average around 26% for the disability pay gap in low and lower middle income countries. Still, there is in both cases the disability pay gap is quite that is unexplained, is quite substantial. For instance, it's around 11 percentage point over the 26% that we have on average for the low and lower middle income country, which is almost a bit less than half of the total disability pay gap.
Great. Yeah, no, thanks for clarifying that. So it is indeed, there's a bigger disability pay gap in low and lower middle income countries, up to, I think you said, around 26%. So also let's ensure that the lesson that the UK is already learning in this area are not, basically the mistakes, so to say, are not repeated in other countries. So just wondering, Angela, Rylin, did you want to come in on the global south, low income countries and the disability pay gap from your perspective, from the perspective of your organization?
Yes, this is Rylin. I'm happy to chime in. One thing, so Microsoft is a global employer and we have employees all over the world, and there's a real opportunity in that to understand and learn about local environments and how to ensure equity and opportunities in every place that we're hiring employees. I sort of like the word opportunity because I loved the clarity of the data and the call out of learning from maybe what's happening in the UK or in the United States. Because often in the Global South, there's an incredible focus on how are we building our workforce? How are we bringing our talent to the economy? What does skilling look like? And that's a chance to make sure that disability is fully involved in that conversation. That when we're thinking about new growing economies and we're thinking about new sectors entering a labor market, if we're doing that from the very design in terms of accessibility and bringing all the talent from within a region, which obviously includes disabled talent, we have a real chance to superpower some wage equity and growth in both economies and disability employment in various regions around the world. So while it's disheartening to see that the challenges are more significant in some countries than others, it's also an exciting chance to look at what did we get right in places where we're farther ahead? What do we do wrong that we shouldn't make those same mistakes? And how do we share our learning in a way that empowers growing economies?
Excellent. Thanks, Ryan. Angela, you also wanted to share your view on the global south, so to say, or global perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think my answer is as in-depth as Sévane's or Rylin's actually, but one thing we did do in our research is that obviously a lot of global D&I leaders are now having to separate their workforce and pay gap reporting procedures because we'll have new and different requirements in the UK. So one of the things we looked at in the research was how UK leads who have a global reach actually engage other countries and other regions that are not white Western regions in data collection and data reporting. And what we found was that UK global D&I leaders the perception from other countries is that the UK is quite data obsessed. It starts with data rather than starting with, well, look what life is like for us in this country. It's not like life is in the UK for most of your employees. And I think the thing that really struck me is that at the very base of this, all of this in every country, our goal is to just make employees' lives better, whether they're at work, and to make them economically, financially stable and well economically and financially as well. So what global leaders said is actually what we are all aligned on, however rich our country and the region we operate in is that wherever any one of our employees across the world is, we just need to get away from the data question and start with, what do our employees struggle with, and what can we as an employer do to make their lives better? When you get the answer to that, then you can start building your data strategy, and then you can start thinking about, okay, we need this information, we need to work on this, and then the data drives better practice as well. But for me, when Global Lead said, you know, we're based in London or we're based in Washington, and now we're working on getting data in other parts of the UK, sorry, in other parts of the country, in the world, most of which those people I spoke to have never visited. The key thing for them was, let's start with what would make our employees' lives better.
Angela, thanks so much. We're coming to an end. Sorry to interrupt you, but look, I see also, I mean, thanks. I mean, obviously we're all aligned and saying, look, what do we have to do to make the experience of workers with disabilities, first getting them into employment and then having a good experience, that's key. Since I see also some exchange in the chat, I just wanted to emphasize, of course, nothing wrong with data. This is very clear. And we actually, as a Global Business and Disability Network, we launched also at our global conference in November last year, a massive report on 10 KPI areas, 2 to 8 KPIs in each of these areas to give companies a choice, so to say, look, this is what we want to measure, including the disability pay gap. So this is not a webinar to say, look, this is all wrong, or, you know, it's just data is important. But of course, it's always, how is it designed? How are people with disabilities directly involved, and how do we implement it? So this was also the message of this webinar. Do it carefully, bring in all the relevant stakeholders, and then, of course, improve the experience of workers with disabilities at the workplace. And there was also a comment of an ILO colleague with disability who I know is, look, obviously it's about choice. If somebody wants a promotion, and most people want a promotion, of course we need to support that person. But it's also the choice to say, look, I'm okay with where I am, and I must not be forced to do something just so a company can fix, so to say, the disability pay gap. And in the end, of course, we want equal remuneration. That is clear. So it's clear there are. And it's interesting for me as a host, so to say, of this webinar. Usually we don't get so many views that are not opposite, but you feel there's a little bit of tension here. And I love this because it allows us to further the discussion. But for today, we have to stop here. Thanks so much to the panelists, Sévane, Angela, Rylin, to all of those who listened. And of course, also to the international sign interpreters. I understand we couldn't address all the questions we got, but it's a lot we can do in any case beyond the disability pay gap to make the experience of people with disabilities in and outside the labor force a better one. So thanks so much. Until the next time, take care.